Welcome everybody to today's lecture on the Hewitson diaries. The lecture will begin with Margaret Dickinson, who writes under the name of Maggie B. Dickinson, if you all want to have a look at some of Margaret's work. She's going to reveal the detective work that led to Lancashire Archives' acquisition of the unique diaries of Preston journalist Anthony Hewitson. Now, I've been told that Margaret actually became interested in local history and creative writing when she was at the age of 7. In the 1960s, genealogy was added, particularly through pursuing her Hewitson family's historic private records and photos, which she was able to share with other interested parties. After retirement, she concentrated on writing the history of the pack horse trade, its bridges and routes in the Northwest. Through many years cycling and fell walking, she was able to write on the subject extensively for Cumbria magazine. Since COVID-19, she has extended her research to log, photograph, study, and write about the history of plague stones in the Northwest. Dr. Andrew Hobbs will then continue the talk, going on to explain the significance of the diaries and their value to family, local, and academic historians. Andrew is a former newspaper and magazine journalist who teaches on practical and theoretical journalism modules at the University of Central Lancashire. He researches the history of journalism, particularly local regional identities in 19th century provincial newspapers and in 20th century county magazines. And importantly, from my point of view, he has just recently taken on the role of secretary to the Historic Society. Now, before I hand over to Margaret and Andrew, please can I just remind everybody to mute themselves before the lecture begins. And I'm sure the speakers will be happy to answer some questions at the end of the lecture. So thank you, and over to Margaret and Andrew.
When you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to share with you my story about the search for Anthony Hewitson's diaries, for they've had a life of their own and dragged me into it. Our journey of 40 years off and on resulted in the purchase of the diaries by the Friends of Lancashire Archives in 2004. But even so, my great-great-uncle Anthony refuses to go away.
Yeah.
In 1907, my father, along with his siblings and parents and Uncle Richard, were in Lancaster workhouse. The authorities found jobs for the men in a village called Wizzle or Wiswell in the Ribble Valley. The men had to walk through the trough of Bowland 30 odd miles to get there. But Granny and the children were given tickets for the train. And when they arrived in Wizzle, 2 cottages had been knocked into one to provide accommodation for the 10 of them. And while they paid the rent, that was fine. But if they didn't, the chimney pot got blocked and the front door was removed. As a teenager, I asked my father, where did our ancestors come from? He said, I don't know anything but from Lancaster. And he told me there was a woman of 6'4", which I thought was a very tall story. The search that led me to the diaries began in 1964, when this book, a handwritten book called Red Letter Days, was loaned to me for 3 months by the cousin who had inherited it. And I transcribed it in longhand before I returned it. I never saw that book again until 5 years ago, when it was brought to my house by the person who had finally got it. And we were so horrified to see the state it was in. Nevertheless, the contacts the contents were intact. It covers the history of our family and belonged to my great-grandfather, Peter Hewitson, a brother of Anthony's. And I'll never forget the day Dad brought this book to my house. As he put it on the table, he was beaming from ear to ear, so I knew it was something good. And he just said, "Silly lad, where I've gotten thee." The person who handwrote it was another brother, William Hewitson, brother to Anthony and Peter. He was a journalist, author, and he was in his final years editor and sub-editor of the Bury Times until in his 80s, when he retired and died a few months later. He'd had a glorious career and he was an honorary member of Lancashire and Cheshire Antiquarian Society and president of Manchester Chess Club. I wrote an article for the Dalesman magazine about the Dentdale stories in this book because it really did put flesh on the bones. And as a result of that article, I got a new correspondent that was to be intense. It was the son of the man we've just looked at, another William Hewitson. We met just this once. We were on holiday with our children in Colwyn Bay in 1967, and he and his wife Dorothy came down from West Kirby on the Wirral, and we got along famously. What he told me that was very important, and I wouldn't have got this out of any records, was that his father, William, and his brother, Anthony, fell out big style because Anthony's son, Llewellyn, married William's daughter, Lily. They had 3 small children. He abandoned her and absconded to America. And what Cousin Willie told me was that they never spoke again. Now we come to my great-grandfather, the other brother, Peter Hewitson. And he'd got these stories from his parents in the winter of 1886-7. Peter was a whitesmith for Lord Ashton of Williamson's Table Bays and linoleum manufacturing, one of the 2 biggest employers of labour in Lancaster. Peter had a daughter called Jeanie, with one leg shorter than the other, and because he was a whitesmith, he worked cold metal, and he'd made irons for her leg. They must have been fairly uncommon in those days because Lord Ashton asked, would he make him a set of 2 for his daughter? And as a result, Peter was given a stereoscopic camera. For those of you who aren't familiar with this type of camera, there are 2 images on a very hard card, and that's
down.
And if you look very closely, because they are subtle, there are differences in these 2 images. And so when it's put in, you get a 3D effect. These children here were taken in 1900, so I wonder how many working men owned a camera with a lens like this. In addition to this, Peter joined the Lancaster Photographic Society. So not only do we have all this wealth of stories from Red Letter Days, we have a brilliant album of photographs to let us know what these people look like. 2 points of interest. One is that these were the children of my grandmother's sister Florence, whose husband Charles worked in Russia, and they lived in Russia together most of the year, but Florence would come back regularly to give birth, although some of the children were born there, and they had 14 children. The other point to mention is that stereoscopic cameras, the expert is Brian May of Queen. This has brought us to my great-great-grandparents, the parents of William, Anthony and Peter.
Because I'm coming here for this talk.
We've got old Anthony on the left, born in 1808.
I haven't been through the way. I'm very stressed.
Alice, born in 1810. They were from Westmoreland and the Yorkshire Dales. And when they told Peter their stories over the winter of 1886-7, when he would go around and visit them, they went back 200 years. And so when Peter was able to get together with William, he repeated them to him, and William wrote them all down and made a copy for each sibling. There's nothing quite like putting flesh on the bones, and this is what the book did. How else would I have known that one of my ancestors who lived near Sellside in Ribblesdale would have perished in the snow a field's length from the house? And I wouldn't have known that I shared DNA with a lady called Miss Anne Sill of Whernside Manor, Dentdale, who was the last of the line who owned sugar plantations in St. Thomas, Jamaica, and slaves. How awful is that? But that is the history, and that happened. She bequeathed a reasonable sum, well, it was a big amount of money in those days, to my ancestor, Dorothy Harling, who was married to Thomas Moore. And that money bought the son in Dent. It bought a farm just down the road. And of interest is that this memorial fountain on the corner, named for Adam Sedgwick, he was the surviving executor of Miss Sill's will, because it was in administration, as they all were, for 10 years, until, horror of horrors, all the slaves had been released and they were given compensation, not the slaves, the owners, for every slave they owned. And in Miss Sill's case, nearly 200, so that the estate benefited by a further £4,000. Adam Sedgwick was Woodwardian Professor of Trinity, Cambridge, for 50 years. He was a son of the vicar in Dent, and he was well in with Wordsworth and Company, and he's also in the family tree. It was in this village that I found the woman of 6'4". She was Nancy Barnes, and she got pregnant out of wedlock, and she was a Quaker. So she was read out of the Quakers. She was also a real knitter and spinner. We also think that the money they got probably paid for Anthony's education, because Thomas and Dorothy moved to Ingleton. And it could have been that Anthony was a sickly child when he was sent to live with them at 18 months old. And it was bracing air, so they said, at Ingleton. But also, they had the money to pay for his education, and he lived in Ingleton until he was 14 years old, and then got an apprenticeship. In those days, searching was a very lengthy and tedious job. I was a very early anorak, and I went about it whenever I could fit it in. There was snail mail mainly, no computers, fewer phones and cars, hardly any societies, not really heard of record offices. There were no magazines, no ancestry.co.uk, and I spent most of my time chippering away in vestries and paying some huge amounts of money out because they couldn't figure out of the house. But the next image I'm going to show you is the lady who triggered off the search for the diaries. When I rang her, she was called Mary Harnden, and this next to her is her husband, Charles, two of the most charming people I've ever met, who lived in Alderley Edge. And she said, "Oh, but you must have grandfather's diaries," which was the first mention of them. And she said, "I'm going to make sure you get them because they're with my nephew in Australia, Robert Blackmore." And here's the letter that Rob sent me in January 1975, when he'd posted the diaries, manuscripts, and books, advising me it would be a slow journey. And in fact, it was a very slow journey because it was a red hot day when Charles and Mary came to our cottage in Pendle. There wasn't that much about the family in here, but I was addicted as soon as I opened the first one. Because Andrew and I have agreed that Anthony wrote these diaries to be read. And so at the time, I suppose he felt to a degree that his throwaway lines would someday be of interest to somebody and hoped people would read it. Well, I became addicted, and I don't make any apologies because it's a long time ago, but I would take one to bed with a Horlicks. And then I'd stuff one in my bag when I went to work, and if my boss was at a meeting and I was straight with my job, I'd crash out some of the entries on the typewriter. But it was mainly handwritten in my own home of an evening. And at the end of the 2 years that I had them, I had transcribed 30,000 words. One of my favourite places to read a diary was at Posforth Gill in the Valley of Desolation at Bolton Abbey. My first late husband was a part-time weekend national park warden, and I didn't want to trail around on his duty, so I would climb Simon's seat. And this was my lunch break spot. And with the tinkling of the water and my flask of coffee and my sandwiches, I would get out one of Anthony's books and he would take me on journeys. We went to see William Gladstone in Barrow. We saw Vesta Tilley perform in Preston. And we didn't half enjoy Charles Dickens reading from Pickwick Papers. We weren't very fond of Edwin Waugh because he took too much snuff. But one day on Fishergate, we stopped for me to be introduced to a man who was out in Africa with Dr. Livingstone. The biggest mover and shaker in our country was Thomas Carlyle, and Anthony was the most literary of the editors. So he liked to introduce his readers to people who were special. Carlyle was a philosopher, a satirist, and the author of the famous French Revolution, for one, living on Cheney Row, Chelsea, which was not a fashionable village at that time because it was all poets and writers and artists. He was married to an almost equally famous person, Jane Bailey Welsh. And there would be a queue from their door knocker, which is incidentally the same door knocker, all the way down to the edge of the water of the Thames. Charles Dickens was a regular visitor, and he used French Revolution for ideas for Tale of Two Cities. Another famous philosopher, John Stuart Mill, was a big mate, John Stuart Mill. And one day Chopin came to play the piano and entertain the guests. Ralph Waldo Emerson came over from the States. And very early, perhaps the first pioneer of women journalists and social reformer, both here and in the US, Harriet Martineau was a great friend. I can vouch for the peace and quiet of this lovely garden. And Anthony managed to get an hour-long interview with Carlyle. They smoked the pipes, and for an hour they chatted away. Both their fathers had been stonemason. Both men were dissenters, and both of them sacked innumerable servants. And when he died, Anthony went to Carlisle's funeral at Ecclefechan with Alderman James Hibbert, who was actually the designer of the Harris Free Library, Museum and Art Gallery, the wonderful Grade 1 building in Preston. Carlisle was a Calvinist, and at the funeral, not a word was said or a note spoken. I didn't particularly choose to move to Preston. Circumstances pushed me into it. But I didn't know anything about it except what I'd read in Anthony's diaries. It wasn't really a place for fell walkers. But I went to have a look round, and as I stood looking at Winkley Square, I thought, I've never opened that folder in 26 years. It's time I did. And when I'd done that, I thought, I wouldn't mind writing about the diaries, but I wouldn't do that without checking with Rob Blackmore. And then I laughed because I thought, how am I going to find Rob Blackmore? I last saw the Harmdens in 1979 when I returned the diaries, and we corresponded for a couple of years, and I knew they'd moved down south. But oddly, I remembered they'd moved to number 1, Rivey Close, Byfleet, Surrey. I wrote to that address, and the following morning, the lady rang me and said, can you believe Mary lived till 2 years ago? And I bought the property from her daughter, Mary Williams. Here's her number. So I rang Mary, and she said, oh yes, Rob's still got the diaries. Here's his email address. And I thought back to my days when I started this genealogy. And this particular question, in comparison to that, had been done within 24 hours, and I was corresponding with Rob Blackmore again. So I went online and I found Winkley Square, and I rang the person, and it was this lovely Marion Roberts, an octogenarian who had been a very, very keen historian and well known for it in Preston. And when I told her who I was, she said, I am Anthony's biggest fan ever. And she said something then I'd never have thought of. So she's another person who was hugely responsible for those diaries. She said, they've got to come back to Preston and I'm going to do something about it. So she turned to Bruce Jackson, who's third from the right, and he was the county heritage manager at the time. And he, in turn, asked the Friends of Lancashire Archives about the diaries, and they said, we'll buy them. His successor is second from the left, Jackie Crosby, who herself, as archives manager, has only just retired. But between them and their staff and the Friends, Andrew and Pauline Wainwright and I, who transcribed all the diaries, had so much help and support that we were very grateful. Andrew and I realised in October of 2012 that it was coming up to the centenary of the death of Anthony. And we must do something about it because he still had a following. Here we are at his grave, or his family grave, and on my left is Anthony Hewitson, who is the great-grandson of both William and William and Anthony. Remember, he was the child of Lily and Llewellyn. So he has a double dose of Hewitsons. And next to him is Martin Dewsbury of Chesterfield, who has been responsible for providing us with the most amazing photographs of Anthony and family. John Hickey, the actor, was asked to play the part of Anthony because Andrew asked his colleagues at UCLan what we could do about a one-man show pretty quickly. And his friend Derek Martin adapted the diary entries that were suitable. Malcolm Sim played the most haunting Victorian music, which accompanied the tears in people's eyes when John read out some very poignant entries. And Christine Niakshu played a servant. I'll let Andrew tell you about the servantometer on the back wall. That was a sellout. It was held on the night of the centenary, and we did another one in January, and that was sold out too. I'm very privileged to have been a part of the diaries, the journey and the acquisition of them by the Lancashire Archives. All the more reason to recall his autobiography, in which he said, "To die, to be buried and forgotten is brutish." And I think you'll agree with me, we're not letting him be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So I'll carry straight on and talk more about what's actually in the diaries. So I'll share my screen again. And I want to agree with Margaret. There's so many people to thank that have made it possible to get the diaries back to Preston, to get them transcribed, and now hopefully to get them published. I actually sent the revised manuscript of volume 1 off to the publishers at 1 o'clock this morning. So I hope by this autumn that they will be published both online, searchable, and as a book. So yeah, I'd want to thank the Friends of the Lancashire Archives, individual members of the Friends for proofreading our transcriptions, to Bruce Jackson and Jackie Crosby and Alan Crosby, who told me about them in the first place, and the Lancashire Archives staff, and particularly Margaret, who I've had such fun with finding out more and more about Anthony and the family. So I'll tell you a little bit more about Anthony's career, and then a bit about what's in the diaries and how I think they could be used. So here's a brief summary of Anthony Hewitson's career. As Margaret said, he grew up in Ingleton, became a printer's apprentice on a newspaper in Lancaster. When he served his time, after 7 years, he became a journeyman compositor, reporter and editor. Went to a few places before settling in Preston in 1858, married in 1858. And they had 11 children, 7 of whom survived. And he moved around between the different papers in Preston until in 1868, he actually bought one of the smaller Preston weekly papers, the Preston Chronicle. And he ran that until 1890. Tried to retire, but wasn't very successful, and ended up buying a paper in Yorkshire. And the Yorkshire years and retirement will be in volume 2 of the diaries, which hopefully won't take as long to get out as volume 1. And he sold them up the Wakefield paper in 1911 and died at the age of 76 in 1912. There's 17 volumes of these diaries and a short memoir, and they span 1862 to 1912. And he saw huge changes in his life, from seeing the railways arrive in Ingleton to seeing a flying machine go over his head on Morecambe Prom. This is a graph showing the census reports from 1851 to 1901, and the blue block is the number of journalists, reporters, etc., working outside London, and the orange block is the ones that are working in London. You can see that the majority of reporters worked outside London, like Hewitson. So he was typical, he was representative. And I think that's what makes the diaries so valuable. Reporters were really important. I might be overstating the case as an ex-reporter myself, but they gathered the sort of raw material of information that was used by so many other people. thousands of other reporters like Hewitson, and that raw material was used for writing leader columns, essays, novels, poems, painting paintings. The information got used by other newspapers and magazines and periodicals. Here's just one little example of something, just a small story that Hewitson reported that spread. So in 1868, some Orange men went to stir up trouble in the part of Preston where Irish immigrants lived. Paddy's Rookery, it was called, near where the university is now. And there was some street fighting and riots. And Hewitson went to report on it. So on Friday the 5th of June, a report appeared in the Manchester Guardian mentioning that there'd been pistol shots fired, as in that picture there. Now, Hewitson was a Preston correspondent for the Manchester Guardian. So it's quite likely that he wrote that report. The same report appeared in the Liverpool Mercury again, which he tended to freelance for, also mentioning these pistol shots. The next day, Hewitson's own paper came out. The same story, the same wording as was in the Guardian and the Mercury, the same gun mentioned. And it spread to other newspapers on that same Saturday, some of it directly from the Manchester Guardian, some perhaps directly from Hewitson. Now, it later turned out that there was no pistol involved and there were no shots. There was an inquest. I think someone did get killed, or there was a court case. But it turned out that no shots had been fired. So Hewitson, as some journalists occasionally do, sort of built his story up a little bit, or repeated the most sensationalist aspects that he'd been told by witnesses. So it's probably that pistol detail, I think, probably pins the story to him, and you can see how it spreads. And so that picture there in the Illustrated Police News, because it's got a pistol in it, that picture is probably based on the report written by our Anthony Hewitson. And that's how information, accurate or otherwise, spreads through this sort of ecosystem of Victorian journalism. And so much of Victorian life and culture passed through a newspaper office. Not all of culture, of course, but that is what makes the diaries so interesting, I think. And I used to say they were unique, the only ones known. So here's a recent search on the National Archives catalogue, which now includes archive catalogues from all around the country. And none come up for this period, apart from, I've discovered one recently, there's just a few weeks of diary entries from a journalist in the Isle of Man he had about 7 weeks in prison. James Brown, editor of the Isle of Man Times. But the vast amount of writing in Hewitson's diaries just far outweighs that. Journalists tended to write a lot of memoirs and autobiographies just to earn a bit of money when they're retired. And they're kind of interesting, but they're nothing like these diaries. Those memoirs tend to be full of name dropping. They don't have much detail. The detail's often wrong because memories, get a bit rusty when you retire, or certainly when they retired. And they don't have very much about provincial newspapers, which was the majority of Victorian journalism. And these diaries are much more immediate, they're more detailed, and they're full of the humdrum detail, the sort of texture of everyday life that's so important to social history. And I think it's this everydayness, this ordinariness that makes them so useful. They talk about his work routines, his socializing, his family life. And because he was a typical Victorian journalist working outside London, I think, they can speak for thousands of other journalists and for the way that Victorian newspapers and Victorian journalism worked. And I would say that the local paper, you could argue, was at the heart of Victorian culture because that information spread outwards from the humble weekly paper so much. And that diary format of recording every day allows the rhythms and the seasons of newspaper publishing and family and civic and religious life to sort of come out. But there's some, so I'm stressing the usualness, the ordinariness of it, but there are some unusual aspects to it as well. And Margaret's mentioned some of the famous people that he met or that he saw on stage. And there's some really harrowing diary entries as well, particularly about his children. So, for example, Sunday the 5th of March, this is Hewitson writing, Ethelyn Hewitson, my daughter, died at 49 Fishergate Hill, Preston, at 20 minutes to 11 o'clock, evening of tonsillitis. Age 3 years, 9 months. God bless her. Same age as my daughter Madge, who died in March in 1863. And then a couple of days later, Wednesday, the 8th of March, my daughter Ethelyn interred in Preston Cemetery at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Minister Reverend H.J. Martin, Independent Chapel. 2 hours before interment, went down grave about 20 feet deep and removed lid above a glass in coffin of my little daughter Madge, interred at same place and same age 2 years before. Coffin put into ground 2 years ago. Said to be airtight, made of iron. Face of Madge dark, eyes sunk, skin dark brown. Hair, cap, etc. perfect. Ethelyn buried in a similar coffin. And then the next day, the entry is my son Ethelbert born between 5 and 6 o'clock this morning. So I was trying to work out, why Hewitson was writing a diary, and those entries are all from the first week. So you can see why someone might start writing about their life in a week like that, where ideas about life and death and mortality are very much on his mind. They're also they're great for the sort of personal and family and social life, but they're also really, really valuable for the history of journalism. They tell us about how Victorian newspapers were made, because so much of what's in these newspapers is anonymous with no bylines. And these diaries bring to life the people that produce these papers, the networks that Hewitson was part of, and the processes and the decisions made that influence what went in the paper. And they reveal the relationships that reporters like Hewitson had, which affected the content. So his friend was getting married and asked him to cover the wedding as a favor. So he did do. He got a free meal out of it as well. You would see Hewitson sharing his notes with colleagues on rival newspapers. So the same information is appearing in different newspapers from the same person, even though they're politically and religiously opposed newspapers, because he was friendly with other reporters. And we see Hewitson, the historian at work, sending his manuscript to other historians for peer review, as we call it nowadays. And they are great for social history as well. So, so there seems to be something on the screen, but anyway, I'll carry on. So this is just a few words that I'm suggesting should go in the index. I've just sort of grabbed them almost at random, from cats to dogs and all these subjects in between. Just a huge variety of topics that he covers, either as a journalist or in his life, or reports stories from other people. And as Margaret mentioned, they went through a lot of servants, the Hewitzons, and there's a lot of humour, well, not on purpose humour, but we can laugh at the way that he writes about some of these servants. So, for example, in 1885, 11th of January, sent servant Fanny Park away today. 27th of January, this afternoon, Dora Hornby of Breckles House, Preesall, near Fleetwood, came to be our general house servant. Wages at the rate of £10 per year. 29th of June, sent Dora Preesall girl away today, a blockhead, amorous, loutish and slovenly, but useful in coursework. Engaged in her place a widow named Jane, wages 4 shillings per week. 6th of July, today blew up before starting the new old servant Jane, idle and independent. 7th of July, at noon today, James Ward came to Brook House as servant boy and gives her wages. They come and they go, and yeah, I just started counting them all. And as Margaret said, almost 50 come and go in that time. So great for social history. And when you start connecting them to other historical sources, new information comes out as well. And there's so many names in the diary, so really, really valuable for family historians. Hundreds and hundreds of names, and I've sort of made sure we've got the full correct name and the birth and the death date of anyone mentioned I can at all possibly find out. So you might find that your ancestors worked very briefly as a servant for the Hewitsons, and you might find out what he thought of them. And it's great for local history as well, and for understanding how local history got written, because Hewitson wrote a fair bit of it. And there's lots of really sort of trenchant descriptions of the characters of people as well. And for academic historians, it's great too. Tells us about things like family and fatherhood and masculinity, the history of reading, history of publishing. And these are diaries written by someone who was interested in diaries and actually edited 2 historical diaries himself. And he talks about leisure and about, you know, culture of a provincial town. And I hope there'll be inspiration for creative people like Derek Martin, who the playwright who put together the play to celebrate Hewitson's centenary. And I hope other people will be inspired by them as well. So just to finish, one example of trying to join up different historical sources. So in 1885, the Prince of Wales came to open Preston dock amongst other duties, and Hewitson reported it. So that's his report of the visit, second visit of the Prince of Wales to Preston in his paper. And there's the opening paragraph. His Royal Highness arrived from Ormskirk, etc., etc. And then we could look in the diaries, and there's a brief entry. Prince of Wales laid cornerstone of our dock today, a big, formal, finely cut affair. Copeland photographed the party. So I thought, well, I wonder where that photograph is, as it survived. And it was in Lancashire Archives in the Red Rose collection. And there we are. There, I've sort of done a little arrow pointing to the Prince of Wales in the shiny top hat. And the person who he's looking daggers at, because they're not looking at him, they're looking at the camera, is a reporter sat at the press bench. And from other photographs that we have, we're sort of 98% certain that that's Hewitson reporting there. And there he is at work. So that's nice to be able to join up his writing in the newspaper, his writing in the diaries, and then another historical source as well. So to conclude, for myself, I can't compete with Margaret for how long Anthony Hewitson's been in my life, but he's been with me at least 12 years or more, and I've lost all perspective, really. I'm too close to it all. But I do think that Lancashire Archives has got a real gem here in these 17 volumes of diaries, and it's been a huge privilege to be involved in getting them published. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how other people use them and what other people make of them. Thank you. So, as Arlene said at the beginning, we're happy to take questions. So you can either write your question in the chat, or if you know how to use the electronic hands up signal, you can do that, or you can unmute your mic and ask directly. So, okay, so there's a comment here from David Hughes. Durham University's electoral violence project records only a disturbance in Preston after the Conservative victory in the 1868 election. I think that if you mean the riots of the Orangemen and the Irish immigrants in Preston, I think that was separate from the election. I think that was probably to do with you know, some celebration of King Billy or something like that. So, any questions?
I've got one.
One. Yes, Christine.
It's fascinating talk, both from you, Margaret, and Andrew. You touched on so many things. And one thing that interests me particularly is the history of audiences. And you, the page, the photocopy of a page, he says he wrote a stirring report. That's what he thought. Do we know anything about his readership, his relationship with the readership, how these papers were consumed at the time at all?
Yeah, we know a bit. I mean, I've written about, if you look in other people's diaries and memoirs and library records and so on, and readers' letters, you can never be quite sure whether a letter to the paper individually, who that was written by, regardless of who it says it was written by. But when you take them all together, you can be pretty sure they can't all have been made up. And he got quite a lot of reader reaction, yes. And you could also get a sense of what people thought of him from rival newspapers. So in Preston, for example, for most of the time he had that paper, there were 3 or 4 other newspapers competing in the same market. And they were always taking a pop at their competitors. And so there's, readers' letters and letters in other papers. There's a great article, one bit of audience reaction was in Garstang, actually. Because Hewitson would do this column called Our Country Churches and Chapels. And he'd go around and review each church, and he'd review the priest or the vicar, how fat they were, what the sermons were like, how good the singing of the choir was the organist out of tune. And in Garstang, they took umbrage at what he'd written about one of the churches. And so they made an effigy, very lifelike effigy of Hewitson, and paraded him around the streets of Garstang with a band playing, then hung him from the market cross and set fire to him. So as far as audience reaction goes, that's pretty good evidence, really, I think.
Mm-hmm. So did the papers have any? Did his papers have any definite political perspective? Was he? Who did he support?
Yeah, they were all pretty much differentiated by the politics. He started off as a sort of advanced liberal, sort of a radical. And he says somewhere that Gladstone, he's a glorious man or something like that, I think. And Gladstone was his hero. But as he got older, and it has been known to happen, he became more and more conservative. And his paper went from being sort of straightforwardly liberal to being more or less conservative. And he was involved in conservative newspapers after he got rid of the Preston Chronicle. And he was quite active in liberal politics, trying to find parliamentary candidates for the Preston Liberals and working in local election politics as well, sometimes handing out the money to voters.
Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat from David Hughes saying about Charles Tiplady's diary, which David's been working on, a printer in Blackburn, who had a diary from 1838 to 1873. Really looking forward to seeing that, David. Yeah, I've seen little bits of his chronicles, his published work, and it looks great.
Yeah, can I speak then?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, it's something I took on just before the pandemic, and kept me amused throughout the pandemic. Probably a similar history to the Hewitson diary, that the Tiplady diaries were known of in Blackburn because Abraham, the antiquarian, local historian and the Blackburn librarian in the latter part of the 19th century, had published a limited transcription in the diary in the Blackburn newspaper in the 1880s, something which has been put on to Cotton Town, Blackburn's local history website, and the diary was lost and was discovered in an auction in Nottingham in 2000. And Blackburn Museum, Blackburn Library and the Local History Society bought the diaries and it returned to Blackburn. And quite a fuss was made of it. They put an exhibition on and had the idea of transcribing it, but the project died. And I come from Blackburn, I've been away from Blackburn until 2015. And I volunteered as a community history for the community history librarian. And as that role, I took on the project. So I transcribed and annotated Tick Ladies' diaries, which I would love to get into a wider audience. I know Blackburn have talked about publishing it for 20 years. And it'd be, I know I've exchanged correspondence with Andrew about how he's gone about with the Hewitson diaries to see if we can finally move publication of the Tick Lady diary.
Yeah, it sounds
like Hewitson, it's valuable in many different ways.
Yeah, no, it's really important, and I hope you do get that published. Yeah. Thanks, David. So there's a question to Margaret. As someone. Okay, thanks, JK, for that. Margaret, the question to you was from Hillary, was it? Yeah. Tomorrow, I admire your tenacity, especially in the before computer years. Did Hewitson comment on any new inventions which we now take for granted and say, were there any inventions that changed the way in which you worked? Are there many stereoscopic photographs in archives?
Well, I'll deal with the stereoscopic photographs. I wouldn't know what they have in the archives. I've only ever seen the stereoscopic ones that belong to my family. But if anybody would like me to send an odd copy to them, if they pass on their email, I can do that. As for changes generally about inventions and so on, what was that place called? The Diffusion of Knowledge, which him and Peterson were very...
The Mechanics Institute. The
Mechanics Institute. There was always new stuff going on there, wasn't there? And what was that about the electricity beam?
Yeah, he was very interested in new inventions, wasn't he? So his friend Peterson was interested in electricity, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He put up an electric light at the top of the public hall.
Yeah. Him and Peterson spent an awful lot of time in the advancement of science, didn't they? For the benefit of the working people. And they just put so much in, particularly Peterson. But moving on from that, didn't he get a new boiler from somewhere? And something to do with his printing machine?
Yeah, so they had a steam-powered printing press.
Yeah. But actually, one thing that struck me is how backwards things have gone with the railways since his day, because he would take packages every day down to mail off to Wakefield for his sons, and there would be probably 3 lots went in a day, and they get there, and the trains will come bang on the time. You know, it was a really marvelous, efficient system. So we've actually lost that. But also the shipbuilding that was going on down on the docks, that all went, didn't it? I mean, that it was a hub of industry, but we went the other way with that. It moved on to other places. But thank you for your compliments anyway.
Okay, there's a question from James K. Is there a script for the play that was performed? There is, yes, by Derek Martin. The possibility of repeating the performance in other parts of the Northwest. Yes, I think John Hickey, is in the audience, and who was the actor that did the play in 2012. And we are hoping now that there'll be some, you know, a book, something out there published. We are hoping to celebrate that in the autumn with a couple of performances of that play. Yeah, if there's a way for other people to perform that same script as well, copyright allowing and with Derek's permission, that sounds fantastic. Yeah. So yeah, watch out for performances in the autumn. Yeah, as John says in the chat, we're hoping to do at least one, perhaps in Preston or in Garstang, if not elsewhere. Okay, any more questions?
If there's no more questions, Andrew, can I just come in now and say thank you so much to both of you for a fascinating talk.